Cortana, all I need to know is did we lose them?
I think we both know the answer to that.
We made a blind jump. How did they...
Get here first? The Covenant ships have always been faster. As for tracking us all the way from Reach, at light speed my maneuvering options were limited.
We were running dark, yes?
Until we decelerated, no one could have missed the hole we tore in subspace. They were waiting for us on the far side of the planet.
So, where do we stand?
Our fighters are mopping up the last of their recon picket now, nothing serious. But I've isolated approach signatures for multiple CCS-class battle groups. Make it 3 capital ships per group. And in about 90 seconds, they'll be all over us.
Well, that's it then. Bring the ship back up to Combat Alert Alpha.
Everyone, sir?
And Cortana. Let's give our old friend a warm welcome.
Halo Combat Evolved released on November 15th, 2001 to coincide with the launch of Microsoft's first home console, the Xbox. I have always been extremely curious of the Xbox, and in my opinion, it's the most interesting console of that generation. Now, in terms of hardware power, the original Xbox was an absolute beast compared to its rivals, and the internals were much more akin to a traditional computer as opposed to the PS2's more proprietary architecture. Also, due to the Xbox's vastly superior specs, it can even output HD, and almost every single game supports 480p, and the widescreen support is pretty common too. In my personal opinion, it's definitely aged the best compared to the PlayStation 2, GameCube, and Dreamcast. While the original Xbox didn't come anywhere close to the PlayStation 2's sales, it did do reasonably okay by itself. It sold about 24 million units, which was actually 2 million units higher than the GameCube. The point of the original Xbox era was to establish an image, which the original Xbox was very successful at. The Xbox Live service was very revolutionary for the time. Halo was also largely responsible for establishing Xbox's image, as it was the first big exclusive, and it was a launch exclusive, and it was being made by a reputable, well-liked developer by the name of Bungie. For those of you wondering and have never played the series before, what is Halo? Delving a bit deeper into Halo, the story for Combat Evolved is actually relatively simple, especially compared to the later games. It makes sense when you realize that this is the very first game in the series, and obviously everyone is in the dark about this when it released. So, Bungie decided to make the decision before release to make the story pretty easy to swallow. Halo, at its core, involves a war between the human race and the advanced alien species known as the Covenant. Combat Evolved begins immediately after the humans lost a colonial planet, Reach, to the Covenant and are trying to escape. As you can see, it's a sci-fi story, and the game is a sci-fi game. The Pillar of Autumn, the spacecraft that the humans and a sentient AI known as Cortana are in, notice a large ring-like planet nearby. Captain Keyes orders that, due to the Covenant ships badly damaging their spacecraft, the crew of the ship should escape to the ring world known as Halo. They awaken the Master Chief, who is the playable protagonist of the Halo franchise. The Master Chief manages to escape from the ship in an escape pod, and after rescuing some other crash-landed Marines on Halo, he finds out that Captain Keyes has been captured by the Covenant on Halo. After rescuing him and taking over the Covenant ship, Keyes informs Cortana and Master Chief that Halo seems to be a weapon of some sort, and that the Covenant are trying to get to the control room. Chief and Cortana then manage to make it to said control room, but Cortana quickly discovers the true nature of Halo and tells Chief to find Keyes. While Chief goes on his way to find Keyes, he discovers that Halo has a living entity on it, specifically the parasitic, zombie-like Flood. As a hive mind, the Flood's goal is to make all living beings their hosts. The Chief then tries to find the activation codes to Halo's defense systems to kill off the Flood, and discovers a small AI by the name of 343 Guilty Spark that guides him through Halo's library to find the activation codes. Upon Chief obtaining the codes, Cortana then intervenes and explains that Halo's purpose, when activated, is to eliminate all sentient beings in the galaxy, to prevent the Flood from finding any host to consume, and therefore killing them off. Chief and Cortana anger 343 by refusing to activate Halo, and he immediately turns hostile towards them. They try to escape to Keyes, to warn him of Halo's purpose and to obtain the codes to self-destruct the crash-landed Pillar of Autumn, which should take out Halo with it. Chief and Cortana then find Keyes, but he's been consumed by the Flood, which forces them to kill him. They obtain the codes, but the self-destruct sequence is halted by 343, and Chief and Cortana wind up going to the Pillar of Autumn themselves and destroy the reactor cores. By destroying them, the Pillar of Autumn self-destructs, obliterating the ship and taking out Halo with it. Chief and Cortana manage to just barely escape by finding a spare spacecraft in the receiving bay, and they believe to be the only survivors. Overall, the story is pretty straightforward, and it's clearly inspired by sci-fi movies such as Aliens. I personally really enjoy it. The later games get a little bit more lore-heavy, but Combat Evolved keeps things simple, which makes sense as this is intended to be the introduction to the world of Halo. Now, the plot twist of the Flood is something that's pretty interesting, as this was something that pre-release details never discussed, and the actual level where you're introduced to them specifically is pretty cool. The Covenant is very clearly scared out of their minds during the entire level, as they're actually running away from you instead of fighting you. And you also notice things like alien blood everywhere, and you catch glimpses of what looks like literal massacres. It does a great job at conveying how dangerous the Flood really is, and it gives a good justification for why Halo is such a catastrophic entity. At Halo's launch, many praised the impressive graphics, the innovative audio design, and the amazing controls. Graphically, Halo boasts really impressive visuals for the time, especially when compared to the competition in 2001, and it features a lot of cutting-edge technology that did a solid job of presenting the power of the Xbox. The shaders, the lighting, the texture quality, and the model quality were all amazing for the time, and I still think they look pretty good today. It has a very pleasant, colorful art style, and it's my personal favorite looking game in the Halo series. There's just something about the skyboxes and the way that they're like 3D animated, it just looks so nice. Halo also features a lot of different terrain, from ship interiors to grassy mountains to caves to alien structures to snowy backdrops. The frame rate can be very rocky at times, but it's still very solid for the time, especially when you compare it to previous generation titles such as GoldenEye, Medal of Honor, and Perfect Dark. Now, Combat Evolved does support 480p, which gives it a pretty clean look even on HD TVs, but the game does not support widescreen. Now, audio-wise, the first thing that must be mentioned is that Martin O'Donnell knocked it out of the park with Combat Evolved's soundtrack. It perfectly captures the sci-fi, heroic adventure feel of the game, and the in-level music also gives a great sense of atmosphere. The Halo series has one of the best video game soundtracks of all time thanks to Martin O'Donnell. That main theme is just iconic. Halo also featured some interesting audio design choices for the time, such as having NPCs react to things in the game or generally talk in ambient dialogue, helping it feel less scripted. Halo also has great sound design in general, with the weapons sounding nice and punchy, and the audio sounds crisp and not very compressed. Now, control-wise, Halo was widely praised at the time of its release for almost perfecting the FPS genre on a controller, and the controls do hold up remarkably well. Thanks to great implementation of aim assist, it never feels like you're struggling to hit targets, unlike many previous console shooters. Halo also features a pretty robust amount of accessibility for the time, as it has a profile system that allows you to customize your controls in multiplayer color. One common complaint, as the Xbox had just launched, was regarding the Duke controller. This thing was considered comically gigantic, and it really is a big controller. However, as someone with decently big hands, I always personally really liked it. The controller feels exceptionally sturdy, the sticks have just the right dead zone sensitivity to them, and the black and white button placement is kind of amazing for 6-button fighting games. However, they can be very awkward for more complicated games that have them mirror the shoulder buttons, which the original Xbox controller lacks, in place of these white and black buttons. To make amends with the consumers that hated the Duke size, Microsoft released their previously Japan-exclusive controller variant, the Controller S, to the Western markets, and was a lot more warmly received. The S controller is nice to me personally, but I absolutely hate the placements of the start and select and the black and white buttons, and it's a lot more awkward for some games than the Duke. The triggers, while pretty good, do have a weird bump in the plastic right above them, so it doesn't feel as natural as it should. Overall though, there's really nothing wrong with either controller. If you have bigger hands, I'd highly recommend giving the Duke a shot. It is a really underrated controller in my opinion, and it can feel quite comfortable in the right setting. All of these factors come together to help make the meat of Halo Combat Evolved, the gameplay. Halo, as you already know, is a first-person shooter with a linear campaign. However, Halo, despite having clear beginnings and ends in the missions, has quite a few missions where the player has wide open spaces to sandbox in. Not large in the Crysis or Metal Gear Solid 5 sense, but big enough where repeat playthroughs of the missions can play out dramatically differently. Vehicles are commonly placed around the larger levels, and there are many various types that open up options to players. If you like speedy, smaller vehicles, the Ghost will appeal to you. Or if you like being more grounded and having your allies or co-op buddy help you, the Warthog will definitely do the job. Or if you want something a bit more big and destructive, the Scorpion tank will definitely do wonders. Later in the campaign, you even gain access to a flying vehicle called the Banshee, which opens up for a lot of verticality. This sandbox-like mission structure largely allows Combat Evolved to feel fun and refreshing even today, and does help compensate for the game's bigger issues, which I will elaborate on later. Weapons also have plenty of variety in how they are used. However, there's not many weapons. There's only 7 usable weapons in the single player, not counting the 2 grenades. Each weapon does have its own unique purpose, however, and because of that, there really is no useless gun, at least on the original Xbox version. I have heard that the PC port by Gearbox nerfed the assault rifle to be somewhat worse, but I'm not quite sure how true that is or what about it got nerfed. However, this game does have the most comically overpowered pistol in pretty much any game I've ever played, and it's a pretty common joke within the Halo player base that Combat Evolved's Magnum pistol is absurdly strong. It one-shots pretty much any living thing to the head provided their shields are down, meaning it just chews through grunts like no one's business. Also, it has a scope, and that's just crazy. The best weapon meta for Combat Evolved is just the Magnum pistol with the Plasma pistol. Specifically so the Plasma pistol charges up, destroys the enemy's shields, and then you switch to the Magnum pistol for the one-shot. Combat Evolved single player also has a ton of replayability thanks to its various difficulty options, with Legendary being a notoriously harder version of the campaign that also adds unique lines and a special ending if you can complete it. In the original Xbox version at least, the special ending is quite funny, and it's worth the trouble. The biggest downside with Combat Evolved's single player really comes down to one thing. The game is very clearly rushed, and because of that, the second half is not quite as strong as the first half. Up until the Flood, Combat Evolved's level design is amazingly open, despite being pretty linear in the actual structure, as there are things like various towers and random outposts that you can get into that makes replaying levels very different on each attempt. The original Xbox version having pretty smart AI also really helps with that. They actually try to flank you and flush you out of cover, so you always have to have a plan in large gunfights. The issue is that once the Flood is introduced, the game's level design gets noticeably more linear and with less free range, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but the fact that most of the latter half of the game is just assets being recycled makes it much less interesting and engaging after your first playthrough. The level that the Flood is even brought up in is just a very confusing maze-like map that gets more tiresome than interesting. It's not exactly so confusing that you'll get lost in it, it's just that it's just very samey looking. It's the same 2 structures, but there's a lot of levels that are like that. The Flood themselves are also not that enjoyable to fight after the first few encounters, as they mostly just consist of large numbers of exploding, shooting, or chasing monsters that die in much fewer bullets than Covenant enemies do. The level that really puts this complaint to the absolute max is the infamous Library level, which is literally just 4 floors of non-stop hordes of Flood chasing you in cramped dark chambers, and it's pretty much known as one of the most frustrating levels in all of Halo. It's not exactly hard, it's just very monotonous and not fun. The remaining levels after the Library are much more enjoyable, but they don't exactly meet the amazing design of the first half of the game. It's just retracing your steps with some added vehicle sections and a little bit of different weather patterns or times of day. What is cool is seeing the enemy factions fighting each other. The heavy asset reuse is due to the aforementioned fact that Halo Combat Evolved had an extremely turbulent development cycle. Halo went through several different revisions, as it originally began as a real-time strategy game for the Mac, then reportedly became a third-person shooter, before ultimately being bought out by Microsoft. Microsoft's acquisition of both Bungie and Halo meant that Bungie had literally less than a year to make something out of the work they had, which resulted in the game being heavily reworked into a first-person shooter. The development was incredibly hectic to the point where the game's multiplayer was actually completely redone from scratch with only 4 months until the deadline. The story, as a result, was very much simplified compared to what Bungie had originally wanted, and the game had to have several sacrifices made to it just to resemble a complete product by the deadline. It all paid off in the end, as Combat Evolved was a massive success, but many of the game's shortcomings are attributed to the very rushed development. Now moving away from the single player, I want to mention Halo's multiplayer. Combat Evolved predates the release of Xbox Live, which was released in November of 2002. As a result, Combat Evolved on the original Xbox features no online capabilities, only possessing split-screen multiplayer and a system link option which allowed people to tether their Xboxes together via LAN and had a maximum player count of 16 people. While I personally never got to experience Combat Evolved's system link, it seemed like a great time for LAN parties and the like. The lack of online, however, would deceive you, as Combat Evolved's multiplayer is actually quite content dense and there can be a lot of fun in it. It features 19 maps with a wide variety of game modes, including Team Deathmatch, Free-for-All, and Capture the Flag. When I did play split screen, it was a lot of fun. The frame rate is a bit rocky on the more complex maps, but compared to the other options at the time of games like Perfect Dark and GoldenEye, this game is much more playable. Combat Evolved also features the ability to play through the campaign with a friend through split-screen co-op. From my experience, the frame rate is all over the place playing like this, but it's still a super fun time. There's nothing quite like driving a Warhog with your buddy on the gun. The only real experience I've had with Combat Evolved's multiplayer isn't really from the original version. Rather, I've played more of it from the later released Halo the Master Chief Collection remaster on Xbox One and Steam. This version actually features online matchmaking for Combat Evolved as well as online co-op. In my opinion, Combat Evolved's multiplayer works really well as a laid-back casual shooter just to have fun, and it really is a ton of fun with the party modes like random weapons on every spawn or the launcher-only matches. That being said, it's notorious for being the most unbalanced Halo multiplayer. The pistol, as mentioned before, is legitimately the best weapon in the game, and only the sniper shotgun and rocket launcher, aka the one-shot guns, can have any effectiveness against it. In a game with relatively slow time to kill, at least with the normal weapons, the pistol 3-shots enemies, as mentioned before. This pretty much turns every match into pistol dueling, as the assault rifle and the alien weapons take way too long to kill. I personally find this a lot of fun, and it helps that the pistol is so satisfying from both an audio and a visual perspective. It just looks cool and it's got so much boom to it, but I can certainly see why it would turn other people away from playing it. Speaking of the ports, I'd like to go a little in depth with the ports of Combat Evolved and how it's been translated to different platforms. The very first port of Combat Evolved was to Windows and Mac in 2003, which interestingly fulfilled the original vision of being a Mac game. The port was handled by Gearbox Software, and while this port was the first version of the game to offer online play through server browsers and the now defunct GameSpy service, this port was heavily criticized for having a lot of issues. The biggest issues of all were mainly visual, and to list some issues, the game's animations were capped at 30 frames per second, meaning that when the game ran above that frame rate, the whole image just looked disgustingly jittery and not smooth, meaning that the best way to experience it was just capping it at 30. There were also many visual effects that were either broken or not correctly converted, meaning the game had a much blander and unimpressive look. The most noticeable examples are things like the Jackal's shields not changing color from taking damage, or how they accidentally used a wrong texture for Keyes' face, giving him a very bizarre look. There's actually an entire YouTube video that explains all of this, and I'm going to link it below because it goes into great detail as to what they messed up with the port. Almost all of these issues carried over into the Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary Remaster for the Xbox 360 in 2011. This is because the Gearbox PC port was used as the basis for all future editions. The Anniversary Remaster did feature completely redone graphics that were toggleable with a button press, but those were heavily criticized as well for straying far from Bungie's original art design for the game, It looks very different, and I'm not really a fan of it myself. The Anniversary Remaster didn't even include the original multiplayer. Instead, it was just a very customized version of Reach's multiplayer with some of the first game's maps ported over. I personally have never played the original Anniversary Remaster, but I do know the reception both at the time and over the years was pretty lukewarm. The Anniversary Remaster was also part of the Halo Master Chief Collection release in 2014 for the Xbox One, and it was also added to the new PC edition in March of 2020. The big features of the new edition was that Halo Combat Evolved now ran at 60 frames per second as opposed to the previous 30. The PC version supports even higher frame rates, like 144 frames per second. This makes the game feel incredibly smooth, and almost makes up for the visual issues. That being said, very little of the issues found in the 2003 PC port were fixed, as the lighting and effects are still pretty broken compared to the original Xbox release. This is a pretty common screenshot that shows how much they messed up the lighting, and yeah, it's pretty bad. This release also features the actual original multiplayer with online, as mentioned before. Mod support is also a thing on PC, however so far the mod scene really hasn't produced anything that impressive, at least as far as I'm aware. Feel free to correct me. Hopefully, 343i can release mod tools once the collection is finished releasing on PC. Overall, Halo Combat Evolved was a smash hit when it released, and rightfully so. Despite its obviously rushed design, it still plays amazingly today, and it's the console shooter that pretty much inspired everything after its release. It's my personal favorite Halo game, with Halo 3 right behind it, and the game just never gets old to me. I can boot it up anytime. Bungie really knocked it out of the park with their first entry into Halo, and Microsoft can really owe their success with Xbox to Halo. 2001 was an incredible year for gaming, and Halo still ranks among the best releases of that year. If I personally had to release Combat Evolved out of 10, I would give it something like a 9 out of 10. It's that good in my opinion. It's just so addicting and fun, even with its issues. Now, Halo Combat Evolved was followed up with a sequel, Halo 2, which had immense hype leading up to its release, and it was released in 2004. Hopefully soon I'll get around to reviewing that game, as I do have quite a bit to say about it. That's all I have for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.